Good evening. Welcome to our doubleheader Washington premiere of Revolution of the Heart, the Dorothy Day Story. Last night we filled Gaston Hall, more than 600 people, old people mostly. Even I thought some of them were old, and had a wonderful evening. We saw this powerful film and we had a great conversation about the life and legacy and faith of Dorothy Day in these tough times. This is going to be a terrific evening. What a remarkable turnout, and you'll be moved by this film and you'll be challenged by this conversation. I'm John Carr. I'm the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. We've been around for about 6 years. We do large dialogues like the one last night. We've done about 80 of those and drawn almost 25,000 people. Probably the most important thing we do are these sessions. We call them Salt and Light gatherings, where we invite young leaders under 40. You may not think under 40 is young. I think that's very young. And an effort to help people see their faith as an asset not only in their lives, but also in their work. And tonight is a great example. How many are here at a Salt and Light gathering for the first time? Well, welcome. That's terrific. The last one we did was on keeping hope in tough times in Washington, and we may need to do that one again. But this is most important. And our partner in doing that, all this, is the School of Continuing Studies here at Georgetown, which I think is just a remarkable place and a really not well known enough example of Georgetown's mission identity in action. And it's a terrific place, wonderful site, but it's especially blessed by good leadership. And the dean is Kelly Otter. Kelly comes from Northeastern University, University of Pittsburgh, the College of New Rochelle. But what is most remarkable is what she's building here, which is a community of learning, of life, of solidarity right here in the middle of the city. So let me just turn it over to Kelly for a word of welcome.
Thank you so much, John. That was very kind. And thank you for the much appreciated public relations. We love that. Good evening and welcome. It's so good to see you all here. Yes, I am the dean of this wonderful place, the School of Continuing Studies, Georgetown downtown. And I would first love to thank our colleagues at the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life for their partnership. This is a wonderful partnership. Over the past 5 years, we do at least 2 events a year. And we're just very honored that our forum and our location downtown is able to bring a bigger Georgetown to a bigger community in DC, a bigger universe. That's exactly how we want this location to be used as an extension of our university's mission. So it's just wonderful to be with you this evening. So tonight's screening is a very special one. It's meant for young leaders like you to think about how you're able to explore the links between faith and Catholic social thought and how these can apply to your own daily lives and work. During a time in which there is much unrest, uncertainty, and injustice, it's important that we remember who Dorothy Day was and what her work was and everything that she stood for. Her compelling faith, her call to nonviolence, her care for the poor, can inspire all of our actions in public life. In the film, we'll get to learn more about her fascinating story and the complicated choices she had to make throughout her lifetime. Here at the school, these events help us to contextualize the education our students receive in a values-based institution that is committed to justice. We aim to provide not only an excellent education, but inclusion in a teaching and learning community that demonstrates compassion, justice, and the elusive but never-ending pursuit of fairness in our complicated and deeply flawed world. We hope to challenge our students to comprehend and act upon their responsibilities with their hearts as well as their minds. And so we are very grateful to be able to host this evening. And I'll just turn it back over to John, and he's going to introduce our panel that we're very, very honored to be with tonight. Thank you, and welcome to Georgetown Downtown.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for your hospitality and your team. The idea for this Washington premiere began when Martin Doblmeier, who you'll meet in a second, came to Georgetown to talk about, ask some questions about Dorothy Day. And we said we wanted to be a part of sharing this message, and this film does it. Too few know about Dorothy Day and her life and her legacy, about the revolution of the heart. I said last night, if you were to list the 10 most unlikely things that have happened in the last 10 years, on that list would be the election of a Jesuit pope from Argentina, an old Jesuit pope. Secondly would be that that Jesuit pope would come to the United States and be invited to speak to the Congress. And thirdly would be, in speaking to the Congress, he would lift up 4 Americans, one of whom would be Dorothy Day. I had the honor of being in the room when he made that presentation, and I went over to the ABC affiliate here in Washington, and I said, I don't know that I really, and they said, oh, we need your help. Somebody in the newsroom said, why is the Pope talking about Doris Day? And for those of you who, Doris Day was an actress, and I thought she was old when I was young, but the point is, not enough people know this message and this legacy. And so to help us understand this incredibly committed, complicated, faithful woman, we're blessed with this film. Martin Doblmeier is the founder and president of Journey Films. He's done 35 films. He's won awards. He's done films on John Vanier, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Howard Thurman, Reinhold Niebuhr, and Cardinal Joseph Bernardin. Before turning this over to Martin, I want to thank all of you for coming out. This is a night for young people, but I want to acknowledge a couple not so young people. Jim Wallace is a star of the film, and you'll see that in a minute. He's a friend and ally. We have family members here. We have some people in the back who couldn't come last night. But this is about you. This is about young leaders. Our city, our capital, needs your faith, needs your values, and the inspiration of Dorothy Day can help you make a difference. So with that, Martin, thank you very much for this film and for this partnership.
Thanks. Thank you, John. This is the second night we've worked together now, John, and I knew John for many years before we had the actual opportunity to collaborate in the process of making the film, and I wanted to thank John especially for making this, and to thank to thank Anna Misla and to Kim Daniels for all the hard work that you do to organize these great events and to allow us to be part of this. This film on Dorothy Day, it's part. I've made 35 films, as John said. This one has got our office really excited. The initial response to the film has been absolutely terrific. You can sort of sense over the years what film is actually going to get some traction. It's the third film in a series that we're doing, that we're calling Prophetic Voices. People who spoke with conviction and clarity over the course of their lives out of a faith commitment that really continues to resonate for us today. The first film was on Reinhold Niebuhr, the great American public theologian. Second one was on Howard Thurman, who was such an important influence on Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. And now this third one is on Dorothy Day. The film starts airing nationally on public television in March as a special for Women's History Month. And we're thrilled to have a film about such a character as Dorothy Day airing nationally on public television for Women's History Month. And 10 days ago now, the film was released on DVD. And it hit #1 as the #1 film DVD release on Amazon under documentaries, and we're delighted about that. It meant a lot to us to be able to do that. We're not Ken Burns out of #1 place, so that was the big moment for us. So I started doing this work back in 1980, making documentary films because I had a background in religion and a background in journalism, and I found a way to combine the two. There was no path for me to do that at the time. I tried to figure out a way myself. And people are always asking about the notion of vocation and what leads you to do what you do. And as I was making this film on Dorothy Day, I kept thinking about how she did not really have a path in front of her. There was nobody clearing the path for her to do what she was going to do. She just did it instinctively. That's the word that comes up again and again, that she did it instinctively. She chose her own path in life, felt as though God was calling her to do that, and never looked back. And I think, in my mind, if you want the clarification of what a saint is, and everybody wants to ask questions, well, is she going to be canonized as a saint? I think that's the first criteria, not so much miracles, but the willingness to go to places that nobody's had the courage to go to before. And she carved a path that's still going. What I find is remarkable is here we are. She starts the newspaper that speaks truth to power in 1933. It's still going. She starts the homes for the people who need it, care and love the most, the homes for the people who are destitute and need to be fed. Those homes not only are going, but they're growing. There are 30 homes when Dorothy Day dies, 30 Catholic worker houses. And today there are nearly 250, all across this country and other places around the world. So to me, this is a woman who leaves a legacy for all of us to understand a little bit about how one person can rise above the flock and do something really extraordinary, and that we can take notice of what she did. And we get a chance to do this through a film, which really pales for the opportunity to sort of carry her storyline. But the truth of the matter is, I think this is someone we can't let go of in the 21st century. She speaks to us volumes today. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the film. So if I could just, before we get started, if I could do one little thing. Washington, D.C. is the home base for us here at Journey Films. And so there are a number of people who are actually very involved in the production of this film, and I'd like to recognize them tonight if I could, because a lot of their blood, sweat, and tears for the last 2 years have been in making this film. So Carrie Schneider, would you stand up and be recognized she's one of the producers for the film. And Mark Compariati, where's Mark? I know he was here. There he is. Thank you, Mark, for everything. And Anthony Bellissimo, who did all the graphics work for us. Anthony, where are you? Would you stand up for us? There he is. Thank you. Thank you for thanking them.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you so much for this film. Thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Kim Daniels. I'm the Associate Director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown. And we've gathered what I think is just a terrific group of people here tonight to talk about this wonderful film. I'm not going to do a lot of long introductions because we have so much to talk about and a short amount of time to do it. But I do want to just mention who everybody is up here. You've seen some of them on the film. And then we'll go from there and jump right into the conversation. You know Martin Doblmeier, who is the filmmaker. We've already talked already. Carolyn Zablotny is very close to Dorothy's cause for sainthood, and she's going to talk with us a little bit about that. Martha Hennessy is Dorothy's granddaughter and a peace activist and anti-war activist in her own right. She is currently facing 20 years of sentencing for a plowshare's action. Ann Snyder is the editor-in-chief of Comment magazine, and she's written evocatively about Dorothy Day, and we're looking forward to her comments tonight. And Robert Ellsberg is the editor-in-chief of Wordless Books, and an editor of so many of Dorothy's writings, her letters, her diaries, and also worked very closely with Dorothy Day. And so with that, let's get started talking about just what a remarkable gift you've given to us, Martin, as well as your team. And thank you so much for doing this and bringing Dorothy to life. You've done so many films about other remarkable people, and I'd love for you to put this in that context and tell us a little bit about what surprised you about Dorothy, what surprised you in making this film. What did you learn that you didn't know?
Oh, well, it's really, I mean, I've sort of been onto the Dorothy Day story since the 70s and read, continuously through these last many years. But then, of course, when you start to unpack the whole storyline, there's lots of little things that you find that you didn't know in the past, and one of them was, I was actually quite surprised. This is an election year. We're in 2020. This is an election year. And after having suffered so much physically to stand for women's suffrage rights, she never voted. And I found that to be a really, really remarkable storyline. I asked you, Martha, during the course of the interviews and everything, and nobody really quite can figure that out other than the fact that If you're going to be a good anarchist, you can't really go out and vote and support the kind of system that you're sort of speaking against. So that was one of the things that really surprised me. And I have to say, too, that I've already gotten letters from people emails from people saying that I'm doing a film about a communist, and how can I possibly do that? So it's been really interesting for me to hear how much pushback there is to the story. I guess I shouldn't be surprised by that. And there are people who feel as though in some ways that they are disappointed by Dorothy Day because she didn't come out strongly in terms of women's ordination, and everybody's got a political agenda. And that's what I think is really remarkable about these characters, and especially Dorothy Day, because they become so vital to us that we really want them to be pulling out ahead for the cause that we care the most about. But I think that's really a testimony to how important she's become. She's really become a central figure in the Catholic experience.
Well, she's such a complex figure, right? And I think there's a line in your sister's book and she says, Kate Hennessy has a book about, Martha's sister has a book about Dorothy, and she says, sometimes when somebody is so complex, it's very hard to talk about them. And I wonder, Martha, I know what we're all waiting to hear is some personal story about your grandmother. One of the things that the film does so well is bring out who she was as a person, but we'd love to hear more. Do you have anything you can tell us about what it was like to know Dorothy Day, to be her granddaughter?
Sure. I think my very first memory was at age 3, really feeling the presence of God sitting in her lap. But when I was about 8 years old, she was at the Vatican II Council in Rome, and she sent me this little postcard of one of Fra Angelico's musician angels, and she had written on it, "Tack this on the wall so that you remember your prayers." And I, of course, lost track of the postcard. 1979, we had a house fire, and then the card popped back up. And there was something in that card that made me really have to examine my baptism.
That's wonderful. And I think that's what we see from this film as well, how much prayer was so much a part of her life. It wasn't secondary, it was essential. 3 hours of prayer a day, I think it said, in so many different ways. Carolyn, I know you have a personal story as well about Dorothy Day, a little bit different, but I wonder, Carolyn is tracking the process, involved in the process of Dorothy moving along towards being declared a saint by the Catholic Church. So you hear a lot from people who love Dorothy, but I think you also talked to Dorothy at one point, is that right?
Well, most of the people here have talked with Dorothy many times. I had a total of one conversation. Fresh out of college, I had joined what we called a radical Christian community in East Harlem, New York, kind of a spiritual stepchild of the Catholic worker. Stepchild because we got paid stipends, and the Catholic workers were poor. So we were just stepchildren. Anyway, my job, I was supposed to manage the little ragtag office we had. And generally I was often there alone, and one day the phone rang, picked it up, and in this strong voice, "This is Dorothy Day calling." Now, I wasn't ready for this. I just arrived here, and I know I had I'm sure she heard my intake of breath. I gasped, really, lost words, and she proceeded to explain she was very kind. She was known for this. She was calling about the well-being of someone in our community who had been sick and who had actually been a former Catholic worker. So I got it together and took the message down. And that really, normally I would think would have been the end of the conversation, And why, I don't know, but there was just this long pause, a little eternity, because I was so awed, and I don't know, maybe she just heard the beating of my heart, but then pause, and then she said, just sort of just kind of bellowed at me, "And who are you?" And the last thing I could answer, right? And what I wanted to say, what I wished I had said, was, I've just come here and I'm trying to ask the question. I'm asking the question of how am I supposed to live this life? That was my question. That's why I was there. But what did I do? I did David Brooks' resume virtues, and I didn't have much of a resume. So, I have a little degree in college. I just got out of it, degree in theology. Anyway, and who are you? Fast forward 50 years later, I'm no longer a young Catholic leader. I got an opportunity to edit this the Dorothy Day Guild's newsletter that's all about trying to explain why she's a saint, why saints matter. And I keep thinking throughout, it's because saints, Dorothy Day certainly among them, ask each of us that question, who are you? And they help us, through concrete lived experience, how to answer it in our own ways, if we choose to live certain ways. So that's my story.
Well, and that's the question, right? I mean, that's the question this film raises, and that we're all called to ask, right? Who are we? Who am I? I feel like when I read your piece on Dorothy Day, that was coming through so much. What did you learn from reading Dorothy Day? How does she challenge you, Anne? Why are you attracted to her as a saint?
I'm attracted to Dorothy Day in so many ways. She was the first person I ever encountered in history who I could actually say was naturally a hero. When they always ask you that question in second grade, who's your hero? I was never really able to answer, and then I discovered her late 20s. And I think, to be honest, at first it was just, I'm identifying with her kind of pre her conversion, not all the things pre her conversion, but there was just her intuitive nature combined with her passions and the ways in which I think she felt very opposite longings. In her younger years, there was just something to her disposition, and then frankly the way she wrote about them, that I just identified with her female to female, and then I think over time, just following her life as I became more and more familiar both with how people would write about it, but also her own words, it was just, there's a way in which she, more than most people I've ever encountered historically, the very paradoxes that she embodied, she found a way to integrate. And she didn't just integrate it in her writing, but she integrated it in her very chosen vocation in life, in many ways that were lonely and that didn't have an industry model. Specifically for me, vocation, she's influenced me in a variety of ways, but in some kind of public vocation, I didn't actually know that story, when the Catholic worker had been out for a little while and that young woman came and said, well, where is this house of hospitality? And then they go and they find that apartment, and here we go, here we start. Just the chutzpah and boldness, and again, sort of intuitive immediacy of saying, you're right, we have to live what we're aspiring towards. And I think as someone who had come from, at the time I was working for the New York Times, and I'd been in Washington for 7-8 years and was getting this was probably 2011, 2012, I was just getting really weary of a model of journalism that was very distant from the subject, and in a city that thrives on abstractions. And there was something in her, again, her personalist approach to writing. She literally would talk about the flavor of the chestnuts that would wind up actually not only going from 2,500 circulation to however many within months, hundreds of thousands, to spawning a certain kind of movement from the very personal encounter with each individual, sort of that pairing of mass appeal with this very unique, infinite particularity that she lived every day. I think I was that's the kind of journalism I somehow have to figure out how to do. And I've never gone so far as to start a house of hospitality like that. But anyways, I could go further. You're not interested in my details, but there was something in the embodiment of her voice that continues to challenge me to this day.
The particularity, the incarnational aspect of
Yeah.
life, all of that comes together and makes her feel very present, I think, for young people today. Robert, I want to pick up on something you said last night. You talked about her as being not someone from the past, but someone of the future. And I'd love to hear what you think about that. And can you explain that a little bit more? Because we see these images of her from over the whole course of the 20th century. And in many ways, she can appear to be someone from the past. But I mean, listen to Anne talking about how her writing is affecting her today. I wonder what you meant by that.
I think a lot of holy people carved out or pioneered some kind of new way of responding or following Jesus in relation to the questions of their time. And they opened up a path for other people. But like a lot of prophetic figures, she also took a larger perspective. She could see beyond the horizon. And you think of her starting this movement in the 1930s, 30 years before Vatican II, talking about the role of the laity, the authority of conscience, ecumenism, liturgical renewal, and social justice in that kind of radical way. Years before Pope John Paul II was introducing solidarity as a theme, of Catholic social teaching. Years before the Church was talking about a preferential option for the poor. Years before the Church was talking about ecology as a dimension of the gospel and Catholic social teaching. And I see her not as someone who's kind of frozen in the 1930s, but who walks ahead and is calling us and is beckoning us. And I sort of think of her as a model or an image of, not Catholic worker houses per se, but if there's going to be a church in the future, if there's going to be a relevance of Christianity in the future, it's going to be because we are catching up somehow with that radical prophetic vision that she outlined.
And it is a radical, it is a vision, it's a prophetic vision. I wonder, that might take us back to you, Martha. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how your grandmother's example led you to lead the life of witness that you lead today. And I, in particular, want to focus on vocation. I think we all are, let's talk about that a little bit too, right? We all have to discern who we are, how we're going to live our life. You've discerned that, and I'd love to hear more about how you followed in this radical footsteps and witness of your grandmother, in a way.
I think that Dorothy had a real genius for understanding individual people and sussing out what they're about or what their strengths are. And I think, every decision that I've made in my life that's been of importance was certainly influenced by her. The profession that I chose was occupational therapist, working with children with learning disorders and with the elderly. And I did that for 25 years. I paid my war taxes. And I just came to a place later in my life of having these seeds that were planted in my childhood and in my adolescence really come to fruition. And when I was quite young, she handed me the book by John Hershey, Hiroshima. And that was something that was seared into my mind, looking at some of those pictures. And I also grew up hearing about the air raid drills and the insanity of trying to duck and cover, and that this was psychological warfare, and she would not participate in it. And also, she had the one lone Catholic voice in September of 1945. I would recommend that you all read this. It's an article where she is just so upset about Truman and the Big Three conference and the dropping of the bomb. And it was a very faithful, very strong voice, but it was a lonely voice. And I don't know. I mean, we are now 100 seconds till midnight, according to the doomsday clock, and I found myself in front of the White House protesting what was happening in Guantanamo. I found myself in Syracuse, New York, protesting the use of drones to do long-distance assassinations. And I found myself walking onto a naval base that houses the Trident nuclear submarine system, where they can strike anywhere on the planet within 15 minutes, the firepower exponentially greater than what was used in 1945. Legislators signing off on these budgets, not knowing what they cost, not knowing the lethality of them, on and on. And I came to a place where I could no longer tolerate it. And I found myself on my knees. In 2004, November 8th, we went into Fallujah on Dorothy's birthday, November 8th. And we used white phosphorus and depleted uranium, outlawed weapons. What was I to do with that on her birthday? And there was just a progression of things that occurred in my life starting in 2002 and on up till today, where I had to take a stand. And this is what Christ calls us to. In the film, she says something about how far will we go following our consciences and following the teachings of the gospel. And I don't know where that will take me, but I'm okay with how it's going.
I love the way you describe that, because most of all, because it shows this discernment of vocation, this answering of conscience, the call of your conscience as something that happens over the course of your life, right? That wasn't a moment and you made a decision and that was it, but it was a continual discerning and movement. It seems like Robert, I don't want to just jump back to you, but I love the images here of you going to the Catholic Worker House from Harvard, thinking you're going to spend a month maybe, and then spending much longer. I wonder if you could talk about that process, and also, since you're so close to her writings, maybe talk a little bit about what words meant to her and how that vocation was important to her.
I went to the Catholic Worker when I was 19, intending to take a year off from college, and well, sometimes things don't work out exactly the way you planned, taking that one step there opened me up into this whole new world, and I didn't look back for a long time. After I was there for a few months, she asked me to be the managing editor of the newspaper, which was kind of crazy. I had no idea what that would entail, or I had no special qualifications for that, except I don't think anybody else really wanted the job. So that sort of kept me there, and it kept me close to Dorothy. And I had no idea at that time that it was kind of leading me, pointing me in the direction of my life and my vocation as a writer, as an editor, as a publisher, as indeed the editor of Dorothy's own writings. But I think she did have some kind of uncanny way of being able to see people, and especially young people. She took such interest in young people. She didn't, it was not like, Sonny, after you've been around for a while, maybe you can write an article for the paper or something like that. No, it's like, she knew I was interested in Gandhi. Write an article about Gandhi for the paper, and write another one, and then edit the paper. And before you knew it, it led me on this long journey. I ended up becoming a Catholic. That's a whole other story. But I think that the point for Dorothy saw the Catholic Worker as a kind of school where people would find their vocations, and it didn't mean staying at the Catholic Worker for the rest of your life, although it meant that for a lot of people. But you would find the very special way that you were meant to be a human being in this world. Using the particular gifts, the temperament you had, the experience you had, and that anything could be a vocation for peace. Anything could be a vocation for making a better world. And so she pointed me in the path of writing and editing and publishing as my particular way of trying to contribute to that beloved community that she was a part of.
We're going to go to audience questions. We have one more question here, and then we'll go to your questions. And we'll have microphones in the aisle, so please, we'd love to hear from you. And please just look for Anna, and she'll have a microphone, and raise your hand after this. But Anna, I want to just have one more question for you. Dorothy Day appeals so much to so many of us, and I think appeals in particular to young people today. What do you think it is about her writings? I see so much, you pick up on so many themes that she's carried, themes of community and solidarity and all the rest. What do you think it is that young people find in Dorothy today?
That's a good question. Definitely the community and solidarity. I think there's, young people forever, probably since the dawn of time, just love the real deal and are really drawn, it's an overused word, but are really drawn to authenticity, which is the word used in the film. And I think her authentic sort of radicalism, which was way ahead of her time in many ways, and probably very lonely, making up a new adverb here. So, and yet, she reminds me, it's funny, when I hadn't thought about it until you just asked this, but I probably have one or two mentors who are in their 70s, later 70s, who have a similar life of like extraordinary activism, often at the cost of friendships and certainly political party and so on. But I think part of why I'm drawn to them is like the example of that early courage when there weren't a lot of companions, combined with like a settled, deep anchor. And that pairing in her of like, I mean, if you read all of her writings, I wouldn't say she was tortured, but there was such like a real worldliness to her very like sacramentality, and she just would say over and over, you know, I cannot survive without the Eucharist, I cannot survive without the sacraments, I cannot survive without prayer. And I think that's something young people often think they can skip,
Sure.
But you're really drawn to someone who has that like inner solidity from which then you can have these amazing adventures. So that was why I was drawn to her.
Makes a lot of sense. Let's go to your questions. Right here.
Hi, my name is Rhett Engelking. I was actually a Catholic worker at Casa Maria in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I wanted to ask a question about, I guess, what I would kind of term sort of Dorothy's holy agitation. And, you know, I've always been struck by how, like, there's always been a tension between the Catholic workers and the local diocese, because, you know, the bishops wield this sort of authority on orthodoxy, but people go to the Catholic workers for authority on orthopraxy, you know, what to do. And I want to specifically talk about like nonviolence as an example, because the Pope has recently said that, you know, even the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. And I know there's a Catholic nonviolence initiative that's working with the Vatican to write potentially an encyclical on nonviolence. So I guess my question for anybody on the panel is how have you seen the movement and Dorothy Day impact the church and its teachings and the way that the social gospel is interpreted, and any comment in that realm would be helpful.
Anybody want to take that? Robert, you want to start?
Well, I think, you know, when Dorothy Day died, I think people, you know, associated her pretty much with the kind of Catholic peace movement or with the Catholic worker. And and I would have been all in favor of waving a flag for her to be canonized Santa Subito right after she died. I think that, in a way, you look, you know, where is Dorothy Day today? It's not just to be found. It's like the empty tomb, not just in the Catholic worker, but in all these kinds of places. A lot of the people who are in the film are people who have connected faith in the world, faith in action, engaged faith and spirituality in some way. And you could say that Dorothy kind of opened up that box way back, decades ago. And so you can look around wherever, it's like the Grapes of Wrath, or wherever there's cops beating up on a guy, I'll be there. Wherever people are working in the spirit of nonviolence, spirit of the gospel, for social justice, for those on the margins, for immigrants, the death penalty, for peace, for the environment, for human rights, all of those people are kind of, I think, part of, are in the company of Dorothy's children.
Carolyn, can I ask you a little bit about that? We noticed in the film, we saw Cardinal Dolan. I know he's been a real supporter of her cause. What do you see, what have your experience been in the Archdiocese of New York in terms of the relationship between the institutional church and your efforts?
Between the institutional church and the...
And your efforts, or like Dorothy's efforts and your efforts towards her sainthood.
Right. Well, utterly supportive. The way it works, it's a complicated process, this canonization business. I think it's easier maybe to be a saint than become a formally recognized one. But at any rate, one of the requirements is that the local archbishop or bishop in the diocese in which the candidate lived has to forward that cause, has to sponsor the cause. But interestingly enough, curiously, really, canonization is actually a rather democratic process for a church not so renowned for democratic processes. This is one of the more democratic, which means it recognizes that the people who knew and worked and loved her, you know, so many, are the first, are understood to be the first to know that there's a saint in our midst. One of the things I hadn't appreciated but learned quickly when I was in the process of editing this newsletter is that the church actually doesn't make saints. It doesn't have the power to make the saint. I think it's a common, I thought it did. I think, anyway, it can only recognize where holiness lies. And the people who knew, you know, the local people, the people who, you know, are the ones who know. So Cardinal Dolan and his predecessor, no, I'm blocking out his name. Egan. No. O'Connor, thank you. They understood this and talked first to, you know, the people closest to her, really asking, should we forward this cause? So right away, I think that was a wonderful coming together of what normally, you know, these tired categories that probably aren't too helpful, but of left and right and all of that. You know, here, there's a convergence that, you know, transcends those categories, which I think Dorothy would be utterly thrilled by, because she was hardly confined by that kind of, you know. So actually, that might be a good prism to look at the canonization of her as a transcendence of that and the bringing together of these vastly different worlds, you know, the hierarchy of the church and the Catholic worker on the Lower East Side, and yet, you know, so.
Somehow you're bridging that, and I think that's what's remarkable.
I think that's really true. And maybe that's a miracle, you know. maybe that's one of the miracles we also need down the line.
Do we have another question? Somebody else have a question for us, for one of our panelists? Oh, okay, I have a question then. We talked a little bit about bridge building, and I think that it's remarkable to think of Dorothy as someone who is not of the right or the left, as you say. And I wonder if, when we say that, sometimes it can feel like a least common denominator function, right? And none of us want that. So I wonder, Martha, if you could speak a little bit about that. It wasn't a least common denominator faith she had at all, right? How is she yet a bridge figure? How in her life, how do you see her, you know, attracting people to really principled stands?
Well, we have to look to Jesus in the gospel first and foremost. She was a practicing Catholic. She, during the Cold War, she stood for the nonviolent Jesus, and that was no small feat in the midst of this culture. And, you know, the message is one of joy and resistance. She was an anarchist, and anarchism stood against both communism and capitalism. Anarchism believed in distributism, communitarianism, personalism, decentralization. And I think that her model was very much based on the early church, where you live in community, you take care of each other, and you're on the run for much of that. And so she gives us a model that's absolutely integrated into the gospel teachings in the 20th century.
People on the move, right? I mean, that was her.
Well, going into the Colosseum to be eaten by lions,
right.
You know, all of those
right.
drastic scenes in the first 300 years.
And one of the phrases, Martin, I noticed, and people talk about her being a troublemaker in the film a little bit. You seem to be attracted to making films about people who were really willing to shake things up a little bit. Can you talk a little bit more about that as a unifying theme here?
Well, or troublemakers. They all have that common denominator at some level of being willing to speak truth to power and to actually live it out. I think that's the real criteria for them. I think that Dorothy Day is that classic example. And you were asking about how do you be a unifier? I'm going to be doing screening events all across the country. There are some events that are being coordinated now. The Quakers love Dorothy Day. She's a pacifist. I mean, if you start to break down the things that she lived for and stood for, there's lots of different entities that sort of transcend just the notion that certainly she is a champion within the Catholic experience. But I think her reach is far wider than that. And a lot of people came in, and maybe Robert wanted to talk about this, but a lot of people came into the Catholic worker movement who were not religious. their interest was, we were sort of always coupling the idea of religion, faith, and social action, but a lot of people were drawn to the Catholic worker who were not particularly religious. They may not have stayed as long, but the truth of the matter is they were still classically attracted to what was going on there because they had that sense of this is really a lived experience of giving something back to people and actually making a practical change in the world and people's lives. So in that way, I think she really was a bridge builder too. So it was not just a religious movement, although she was certainly unabashed about what her faith was, but what she was actually doing day in and day out attracted all different kinds of people, people who were religious and not so religious.
That's great. And let's check back to you, Robert. Before we keep on going, I do see. Do you have a question? Saw your hand go up. Sure.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Coleman Birch, and my husband and I both have spent a little bit of time with different Catholic worker movement houses. And my question is about Dorothy Day and family life, and particularly maybe Martha could respond to this question, but anybody as well. I feel like those of us who have spent some time in Catholic worker movement houses have experienced the flow of young people through the houses and how this can sometimes be a short-term thing in a person's life, something you can give to when you're young and single. But Dorothy had such a commitment to her family, as the film mentions. And I would like to hear a little bit more about how she thought about and envisioned how families could live out this mission, what this could look like for not just single individuals, and how she lived out her commitment to her family.
Thank you. Well, Tamar grew up in the bosom of the community. My sister Susie raised her 3 kids in the community at the Tivoli farm. And there were many models. There were many ways of meeting the needs of individuals. I mean, she believed in keeping things small and keeping things personal. And there are many families who have raised kids in the community, and then there are others who have chosen to have a separate space for their young children. So I think the model just allows for what works for individual people. And Tamar had wonderful memories and stories to tell about growing up in that kind of an atmosphere. So I think there's no hard, fast rule, and I think the question of tolerance and diversity has certainly contributed to the longevity of the movement, where there's a niche for anyone who comes. It fits in.
Robert, what was it like to be in a Catholic worker house in the early 70s? What did it feel like? Martin talked a little bit about people coming from all different faith backgrounds, and at the same time you hear so much about her devotion to her Catholic faith and the sacramentality of it. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of what that felt like and what faith felt like in that environment as well?
It was kind of a young community when I came there, and most of the people who were my age or a little older had come from kind of solid Catholic backgrounds, and that didn't really apply to me. I was really attracted more to the peace witness of Dorothy Day and the images of her being arrested, and she seemed to me to, in that sense, to kind of represent an authentic and radical form of living the gospel that I'd been searching for. But I didn't really understand the whole Catholic thing, even when I was editor of the Catholic Worker, which is one of the reasons I only did it for a couple of years. I had to step back, and it took me a while to really understand that she really meant all this stuff, that the Eucharist and the church and the lives of the saints were real to her, and that was the foundation behind that witness that had so inspired me. And it was a long pilgrimage of my own, led to my becoming a Catholic myself. But the life of the Catholic worker was very improvisational. It wasn't a 9-to-5 kind of job. It was a way of living, living with other people, living in a way that was open to the pains and the hurts and the anger of a lot of damaged people. And those damaged people were not just the guests, they were part of the community. We all had our own wounds that we shared. But every day could be a little different. It would begin with certain kinds of rhythms of preparing for the soup line, and then there were the rhythms of preparing to send out the newspaper, putting it together, folding it, mailing it out, the rhythms of going to the market to beg for vegetables. But then there would be demonstrations. Someone would call up and say, we need you at the UN, we're going to be fasting for Chilean prisoners, or something like that. One of my best experiences of fasting until death lasted between breakfast and lunch, when I went to occupy this UN building, calling for a UN investigation of Chilean political prisoners or something. We went in there, we unfolded these banners, no one even knew we were there. And then by lunchtime, we found out that our demands had all been met. And we went out and we had a very joyful breakfast. But it was a kind of way of being, a kind of freedom that I associate with sort of the Franciscans or something. That when you're living in a life of voluntary poverty, you're not worried so much about where your next meal is going to come from or how you're going to pay for your insurance or that sort of thing. There was just a kind of sense of liberation, and also a sense of engagement in history on some deep level. Here I was, this kid, and yet I felt that we were on the cutting edge of fighting for a better world and for peace and opposing nuclear weapons and for human rights and all this kind of thing. It was a sense of tremendous exhilaration and excitement and something deeply meaningful that I still look back on with a lot of nostalgia.
I love that. I love that idea of engagement with history. And just very briefly to you, Martha, I feel like right now you must have that sense as well. I wonder if you get that sense of being engaged in history also through your daily life of not just the big things you're doing, but through your daily life of engaging with your Catholic faith and with this tradition of the Catholic worker.
Well, here we are in the 21st century, and Peter Marn spoke about culture and cultivation, and I find it completely applicable and relevant today. History in the making, and we do need to pay attention. If there's one thing I clearly remember from both Tamar and Dorothy is pay attention, listen. And I think looking at the suffering of others is a very good way of tracing what the problems are in the world. And people are suffering tremendously, and I have nothing but admiration for those who can step up and respond to that. And right now, what is it? It's Venezuela, it's Iran, it's history in the making, and how do we live our lives as being at the center of this privilege and empire.
And it's responding to that suffering with mercy, with what Pope Francis calls the beating heart of the gospel, right? Mm-hmm. That's what we're called to do. We're almost to the end of our time tonight, and I wonder, before we go up to the reception upstairs, and I hope you're all going to join us there, and we'll have more chance to talk with these folks and with each other. But I wonder if we could just go down the aisle here, down the line, and talk about what you took away from this conversation tonight, our conversation last night, and the film in general. And Martin, can we start with you?
I would say that in the last film that I did, it was a film on Howard Thurman. I know there's a lot of conversation about life and direction and vocation. Howard Thurman had a classic line where he said, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive. And because what the world needs are people who've come alive. And through that lens, I was watching the film again, and I try to look at it every night that I have to watch the film. I sit through it, and I think, well, what's going to be my lens to look at the film again tonight in a different way? And that was the lens that I put it through, and I kept thinking how what happened to her, it was almost like the Augustine line who says, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, O Lord. And you can see that there is a clear line that happens to Dorothy Day at those early years, which are clearly understandable, experimentation, trying to understand who I am, what I'm supposed to do, where I'm going to go, what do I mean in this world, and what does the world mean to me? And in the end, once she gets the radar set and decides this is the path I'm going to take, she follows it for 50 years. And she lives it in such a way that she inspires literally thousands of people after that. 40 years after she's gone, we're still gathering in a movie theater to tell a story about her. That's the life of conviction, as far as I'm concerned.
Wonderful. Carolyn?
Well, picking up on what you just said, Martin, the last 2 days, tonight certainly, and last night at Gaston Hall, I guess is the name. It reminds me. I was thinking a lot about The Long Loneliness. Do you know that book, her autobiography? I really think it's one of the best ways to get to know her. You really feel her yearning. And anyway, there's that famous passage where she says something about, I think it's at the end, forward or whatever, backward. We were just sitting around talking, and then someone said, let's start a stoop line, or let's do this, but we were just sitting around talking, and all these things grew and happened and are continuing to now. And I was thinking about the relationship between conversation and conversion. And I think I just want to say, I hope the conversation, I know it will continue. And I'm glad and so grateful to be a part of it. Thank you.
I'm grateful to have you. Martha?
Well, she continues to comfort me, and she continues to provoke me, and I find great joy. The story is an amazing, remarkable story, thoroughly embedded in U.S. history. And the joy of prayer, the joy of life, of loving one another, and walking with God, that's just something she gives us day after day.
How about you, Anne?
I wasn't going to share this, but I was sort of feeling moved to at the end of this time. A few hours ago, a friend gave me, I guess it can't be a real icon because she's not a saint yet, but I have like a little icon of Dorothy Day, your grandmother, that stares down at me in my little office on top of the bookshelf. And somehow she's like, there's a Bible underneath and there's a bunch of other things. And I was sort of trying to refresh my mind and heart on all things day before tonight. And I was looking at her, I was like, I think I need to, it's not that far from where I live, I need to take the 12-minute drive to the Basilica where her vocation began. And I've been to that Basilica quite a few times, and I love it for its global feel, especially in the basement, but to be honest, I've always been quite scared of the huge Jesus that they have painted in the front, who looks like he is a champion in global P90X or something. So, I was up there for a bit, and I've been downstairs, but I always assumed Dorothy, when she prayed that desperate prayer to try to find synthesis between this hunger march and her newfound, 5-year-old Catholic faith, that she was up there, and I was like, is she really looking at that Jesus? Because I don't see how that would birth the Catholic worker movement. So I was feeling restless, and I wound up going downstairs, and I found the crypt that was in the film, and I kind of got goosebumps seeing that. So I was there for an hour and a half, a few hours ago, praying and reading this compilation of her writings that's, I think Plough Quarterly put out, or I may be wrong about the publisher, but called, or Plough Publishing House, called Just the Reckless Way of Love. Oh, yeah. And I just thought, instead of my takeaway, I would read these words because they felt convicting as ever, but also once again, words for our time. For everyone on all sides of the ideological and even theological spectrum. She wrote, I am convinced that prayer and austerity, prayer and self-sacrifice, prayer and fasting, prayer and vigils, and prayer and marches are the indispensable means, ... and love. And then she catches herself, and she at least writes in this compilation, but all these means are useless unless animated by love. Love your enemies. That is the hardest saying of all. It is a terrible thought that we love God as much as the one we love the least.
That's beautiful. That's wonderful. And if you've not been to the Crypt Church in the basement of the Basilica, I really, really encourage you to go. Maybe that's one action step from tonight. People are always using that kind of language in Washington, and I love to direct that towards heading to the Crypt because it's a beautiful, beautiful place and a very holy place.
It is. Yeah.
Robert, how about you? What's your takeaway from tonight?
Well, maybe continuing that theme, since great minds seem to be thinking alike today, which is that my wife and I also went to the Basilica and went down to the Crypt, and I'd been there before. And I went to the little side crypt, which is apparently where Dorothy uttered her prayer. She said with tears and anguish that she would find some way to reconcile her faith with her desire to serve the poor and the oppressed. And it was very dark, they're quiet, and I see this white-haired lady sitting in the front there, and a little double take, and it's Martha, of course. But there are two things about that prayer that first of all, she makes this prayer for her vocation, and it's like she opens her heart, in this deep way, and then she comes back and she finds Peter Morin, who is like the spark. She had this kind of kindling, that was ready to be lit on fire, and Peter Morin did it. But there's something that I only discovered when I edited her. First I edited her diaries, then I edited her letters. And one of the very moving discoveries there was the series of several dozen letters that she wrote to Foster between the time of the beginning of their relationship and the end. And in her autobiography, she kind of tells this story about, it got to be this point between God and man, and I chose God. And then she had a bunch of lonely years. Then we pick up, 5 years later, and she's starting the Catholic Worker. And reading this, it put it in a whole different perspective, because you see, she spent this whole 5 years trying to beg and cajole Forster to marry her. That was her dream. That was her desire, her heart's desire, to have a family and to be married to Foster. And he didn't believe in marriage. He wouldn't do it. And you see that everything in her life came from the frustration of her heart's desire, or what she thought was her heart's desire. And when she makes this prayer, and she doesn't spell it out in those kind of terms, but I realized then it brought a whole different dimension to when she writes, I offered up a prayer with tears and anguish to find her vocation. Because the last letter to Foster is that month, December 1932. And she comes home, it's as if she writes to him, this is all I've wanted, I now know it's not going to happen. And so she closes the door on that. And it was in doing that it made it possible for everything that came next. And she was receptive to then when she finds this shabby man with a thick French accent that nobody takes very seriously, with pamphlets bulging out of his pockets and everything on her doorstep, and suddenly can hear and see, this is the answer to my prayer, So I don't know, I just find so many different levels of meaning in that story that apply to all of us, whether we're going to start the Catholic Worker or whatever, but of trying to really open our hearts in a deep way with tears and anguish if need be, to be able to find and be able to recognize that sign, that spark, when it crosses our path.
And if after all that you're not receptive to the idea of going to the crypt and praying on all of this, this has just been beautiful, and what a wonderful conversation. I want to just let you all know that our next gathering like this will be on April 14th. We'll have another Salt and Light gathering, and we'll be focusing on the campaign. We'll be doing it in conjunction with Theology on Tap from the Archdiocese of Washington. So please look for more details on that coming up. Over at Gaston Hall or over at Georgetown's main campus, we'll have another series of conversations about faith in the faithful in the campaign. So please look for all of that from the initiative. And we hope we see you all upstairs right after this. There's lots of good food. There's popcorn, there's candy, and there's lots in keeping with the movie, and lots of other good food and drinks. But most of all, please join me in thanking our wonderful, wonderful participants here.